Okay, today we're doing food and cooking vocabulary. Let's start with to boil, because it's a very useful word. Everybody has boiled some rice before, I'm sure. So boil means put something in the saucepan, and please learn these kitchen utensils as well, they're very useful. You boil things in the saucepan, so you put your rice in the saucepan, you fill the saucepan with water as well, and then you boil the water. And water boils when it reaches 100 degrees Celsius. So we use this word for a lot of different cooking, and we also have the word simmer, which means almost boil, just below the boiling point. Keep it at that kind of bubbling. Simmer, when something's simmering, it's often bubbling as well, but it's not completely boiling, so it's just under the boiling point. If you leave the rice to simmer gently for 5 minutes, or allow the rice to simmer gently, simmer means that just below the boiling point, okay? So 98 degrees Celsius or 90 degrees Celsius, something like that. And you do the boiling in the saucepan. But very often you forget about the fact that you're cooking the rice, and you suddenly hear a noise, and you can hear the water is boiling over the saucepan, and then it starts to drip onto the cooker. So drip onto is quite a good phrasal verb for this. Drip onto. Yeah, to drip is a verb, meaning that the water is blip, blip, blip. But yeah, when the stew or when the rice boils over, it means that the water has gone over the sides of the saucepan and started to drip onto the cooker. You're going to have to clean the cooker later. And of course, this always happens. Okay, so remember boil over. And you could say, don't let the soup boil over, don't let the stew boil over, something like that. And by the way, stew is very similar to soup. I think of it as a very thick soup, yeah. Usually, my mum would always cook a stew, and it was very tasty, turkey stew, and it was always really thick, much thicker than the soups that I had. So you cook a stew in a very similar way to a soup, but usually there's a lot of vegetables in there, and meat. Anyway, so yeah, we've done simmer, and you remember we leave the rice to simmer, or allow the rice to simmer, and don't forget drip onto. Now, simmer and boil are very often used as ways to express emotions, because we think of emotions, especially anger, frustration, resentment. We think of them as building up inside of you, and they get to a point when they start to boil, and that's when they escape. That's when they flood out or pour out. Notice pour out is down here. These emotions pour out of you when you boil over. So we do say she was simmering with resentment, and that means the resentment was building up and building up inside. Yeah, it was getting bigger and bigger, stronger and stronger inside of her. So she was simmering with resentment. And in the end, after simmering with resentment for several weeks, maybe her anger boiled over, her frustration boiled over, and she started screaming at people, shouting at people, who knows, you know, but she reacted. She expressed that anger, that emotion. And so certainly boil over is used with emotions, and so is simmer. So yeah, do remember these kind of expressions as well, because they're just metaphors. Boil over literally does mean to boil over the sides of the saucepan, but we think of emotions doing the same thing. When they build up, they get hotter and hotter and stronger, and then finally they boil over. So you can certainly use it like this as well. The protest boiled over into violence, yeah? And notice again, it collocates with violence and anger. And here we picture the protest metaphorically becoming violent by using this verb, yeah? The protest boiled over into violence. It became violent. And you can certainly say he was boiling with rage, yeah? Boiling with anger, boiling with resentment, frustration, whatever. But it's usually an angry feeling when you're boiling with it. Now, spill over is very similar. And you can say, don't let the stew spill over the sides. I mean, it doesn't have the same meaning because it doesn't have the boil aspect. But, I mean, if water spills over the side, you might spill some coffee over, well, here, I've got it right here, actually. I spilt my coffee on or over my student. Now, that means you accidentally dropped coffee on the student, and it went on the student. So spill is accidentally pour. Yeah, if you knock over a glass, of wine, you spill the wine on the table, you spill the wine on your wife's new dress, whatever it is. But a second meaning with spill over into, is when something goes over into a new position, into a new territory, into a new area. And again, it's often used with conflict. The conflict has spilled over into neighbouring regions. Yeah, the violence has spilled over into neighbouring regions. The war has spilled over into neighbouring regions. That would work very well as well. Now, you fry things in the frying pan, yeah, and so make sure you know this frying pan. The frying pan is where you put oil on the bottom, very often sunflower oil or cooking oil. I think that's a rubbish one, isn't it? Let's try this one. Sunflower oil, something like that, or olive oil. Yeah, you use some kind of cooking oil, and you put the oil in the frying pan, and then you fry your whatever it is. You might be frying meat, you might be frying potatoes. There are lots of different things you can fry. And you do all of this on the cooker. Now, one thing that you've got to all memorize right from the beginning, because it's annoying, it's really illogical, but we don't say cooker for a person, yeah? Teacher, you know, doctor, builder, lawyer, these are usually for people, aren't they, when we put an ER on the end. But not this word. Cooker is not a person. The cook is a person. The cook is the person who wears that white hat. The chef, you might say. Cook is just a less professional, a lower version of a chef. A chef is more professional. He works in a very expensive restaurant, yeah, and that's a chef. But cook is a person, chef is a person, cooker is your machine. It has an oven on it, usually. It has 4 hobs. Yeah, my one has 4 hobs anyway. You might have electric hobs, you might have gas hobs. I have gas hobs. I prefer gas. I think it's much easier to control the heat. But yeah, cookers have hobs, they have ovens, they have extractor fans so that the smell doesn't go everywhere. My wife hates it if I don't turn on the extractor fan. So yeah, remember fry, remember cooker, and remember that cooker's a machine. It's not a person like a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, a builder. Okay, you bake cakes or biscuits in the oven. Yeah, and the oven is the big box. That's, I mean, it's a hot box, isn't it? You put it into the hot container, which is the oven. And you bake, we use that verb with cakes and biscuits. But you roast, and it's still putting it in the oven, with chicken or vegetables or other meat. You roast your meat, you roast pork, you roast chicken, you roast your vegetables. And it means that you put them in the oven, okay? Now, when you're putting cakes in the oven or biscuits, when you're baking those cakes, you're probably going to put them in a baking tray. Yeah, and that's one of those trays. Sometimes they're made of metal. They usually are, in fact. They're made of metal. And they look like a tray. They really do look exactly like a tray. And you can see why they're called baking trays, because they often used to bake cakes or biscuits. I use a baking tray not to do that, actually. I use a baking tray when I cook my lamb kufti.